My name is Johann Hattingh. I'm the chief editor of IBFD's Bulletin for International Taxation. And the journal this year is celebrating its 75th anniversary. This November, we will publish a special issue dedicated to the theme of 75 years of international taxation, looking back and looking ahead. And I'm very delighted today to welcome with me in this interview, Professor Parthasarathi Shome, who is an economist and chair of the International Tax Research and Analysis Foundation in Bangalore in India, who is an author of an article that will appear in the special issue. The title of the article is "The Absence of a Stable Core in the International Taxation Regime." Welcome, Professor Shome.
Thank you very much.
Professor Shome also authored an article in the 50th Jubilee issue of the Bulletin in 1996, and we will come back to that a bit later on in this interview. But to start off, Professor Shome, I wonder if you can tell us what motivated you to write on this intriguing topic.
What motivated me basically is that as I face international taxation issues, and as I faced it a few years earlier in India, when I was a Minister of State in the Ministry of Finance, that I found that there is an academic interest in the subject, but there was a very great distance between advanced economies and emerging economies at many points, and also within advanced economies. And then with the inexorable rise of the digital economy, artificial intelligence, and so on, the ability to internationally tax the incomes and profits being generated by such new and dynamic sectors has become more and more difficult. And countries, including many advanced economies, like Italy, France, UK, and so on and so forth, are struggling to tax it. So are countries like Turkey and India. And whereas the US has taken another position. So it's very difficult, one sees, as time is progressing, to perceive an equilibrium that we are approaching. And therefore, I was motivated to take up this topic.
Thank you. So the article is very clear in that you identify basically 5 broad areas where you see a sort of a permanent status of flux in the regime. And cumulatively, they add up and they speak to each other. And I am going to ask you some questions about each of these. So the first one you describe is the source principle in source taxation. And you suggest that the acknowledgement of this principle is on the rise. So I wanted you to explain to us why you say that.
Yes. The source principle vis-a-vis the residence principle has been a bone of contention for emerging economies in particular, because the emerging economies were primarily the source of the supply in an international supply chain of production, whereas the advanced economies were the residence of where the capital resided and emanated from. So for the last 100 years or so, the advanced economies at a stage when they were the colonial powers and made the rules in the 1920s. The sincere philosophy at that stage was that the profits emanating for the use of capital should also reside in the countries from where the capital was exported. And so the importance of the value added in the supply, that is from where the supply was being sourced, that really didn't feature. Whereas since the colonies became independent, often led by countries like India, since its independence in 1950, slowly the argument has been pushed by such countries that source where the supply is emanating from the original capital in the residence countries, the source countries should also get a fair share of the profits that are coming out from the supply. And this was at a point when OECD in the post-Second World War era came into being. It was frankly a club of advanced economies and didn't really quite think or go along with this view or even considering this view of emerging economies. And however, the 2008 global financial and economic crisis led some of the advanced economies to witness a crash in their revenue intake. And they probably perceived the possibility of getting more revenue from the source principle if they applied it to themselves. For example, they were they were the source of a lot of products whose capital resided in the USA, where they were headquartered and so on and so forth. And that slowly brought the OECD to a reconsideration of the whole issue. And therefore, after the 2008 crisis, the G20 was revived, the group of 20, and the group of 20 gave the OECD the responsibility to come up with a set of recommendations whereby the very high tax avoidance of multinational corporations, or let us say perceived tax avoidance, could be brought down. Overall global revenue could be brought up, and in that process, even source principle or whatever principle, wherever it is justified, whether a fair share of revenue, that is revenue sharing across countries, could be devised. And in that process, the OECD began from around 2010, and subsequent many papers that they brought out even a little earlier. But once the BEPS, base erosion profit shifting, BEPS project took hold, one sees a series in the actions that OECD has tabled, that many of them are in favor of source also as being recognized for revenue or profit attribution. And slowly you see, therefore, that the OECD has taken this position very lightly, but very clearly, with, in a way, the support of most advanced economies. But the advanced economy is the leader economy that is difficult to be brought on board, which is the United States.
Indeed. So in your view, what does this all mean if we think of the permanent establishment concept, which is this champion concept that comes from Europe, from Germany, and where the realization now is that source tax is perhaps more important than historically thought to be?
Yes, let me use the abbreviation PE, where PE was concerned, slowly the concept of PE was also becoming or also being reformed, I would say. And with an international agreement step by step on proceeding where the PE concept would finally end up. Basically, instead of saying that the permanent establishment was always where the multinational was incorporated, the concept was broadened to include the fact that you can have a lot of activity and virtual management meetings and or high sales in places where the multinational operates with local participation, whereas the capital is in the original residence country. So the concept was being extended, including the concept of poem or place of effective management. So that also country after country was introducing, and therefore the general agreement was that place of effective management was often the place where the supply was being sourced of the production, and that is where the revenue attribution or profit attribution should take place. The final and most recent complication that is arisen is the virtual permanent establishment concept, which the OECD actually had introduced, but and had said that if there is a certain amount of sale above a threshold in a particular location, which is not the residence location, then that location where the supply is actually occurring over a threshold, that jurisdiction also would have a right to tax. So it was a virtual permanent establishment. However, while introducing the concept, the OECD, I think in a way cleverly or coyly, also added a phrase saying that this is a matter of discussion only. However, I think increasingly it is becoming quite important, especially with the emergence of the digital economy and artificial intelligence, robots, and so on. Because with robots and operating and being produced and the whole supply chain occurring through robots, the whole game, which is based on certain rules, let's say poem and so on and so forth, becomes even murky because you really don't know where and how robots are participating. And now there is a huge literature emerging showing that very soon robots, I mean, it's really still at this point sounds a bit fantastic, but there are quite a few tax experts who are taking this very seriously and saying that very soon we really would, as the proportion of production increases through robotic participation, we will have rapidly decreasing revenue base because we wouldn't be able to attribute profits clearly. And therefore, one has to think of permanent establishment and source, that is a modified permanent establishment, and clear definition of source where all of this is occurring, and attribute profits accordingly. And therefore, I feel the advent of the source principle is arriving.
Wonderful. We'll come back to the digital economy shortly, but I want to just step back a moment to what you said about capital ownership and residence countries. Of course, those residence countries are sometimes a low tax jurisdiction. Mm. And the other factor that you identify is what you call the ineffectualness of the OECD to address these low tax or countries or tax havens. So I'm wanting to ask you, why is that? Why is there this ineffectualness?
Well, OECD is a voluntary research organization put up mainly by advanced economies originally. They have expanded the number, but the new members are all at least highly middle income economies, and they aspire to be advanced economies. So there is clearly there has to be a homogeneous manner of thinking, and the OECD therefore can come out with homogeneous thinking. And therefore, given that already, if one looks at it historically, the tax havens are really managed by a handful of very advanced economies, the OECD can at best point out the issue, point it out as a quasi problem. I mean, just lay it in front of everyone, rather than really come out in a strong manner. By contrast, I think in this area, the European Union has taken better measures and more clear measures, and in fact has strongly recommended that there should be a list of actions that should be taken by these countries. And very interestingly, the many of the tax havens are dominions or dependencies of the very advanced economies. But for the very fact that the European Union has come out with it shows that the leader countries in the European Union are not entirely against it at this point, because they have come to realize that if there is such a depletion of the revenue base, then what is the point of taking a huge financial undertaking and research undertaking and bringing out the BEPS actions and so on for the world as a whole. At the same time, it is very interesting which heavily advanced economies are not within the EU. And it is also interesting to kind of connect why some of these economies are going out of the EU. And therefore, one can see that the attitude towards tax havens among advanced economies is quite varied. European countries in the EU are bringing out this list. The EU is bringing out this list. On the other hand, there are a few important economies that are not within the EU, and therefore they are still very free to use these tax havens, and they do.
Thank you. To get back to the digital economy, in your article, you describe what you call lingering issues that's not going away, in other words, that's contributing to this instability. And I wanted to ask you about some of those. In the very current debates about the reforms, the Pillar 1 proposal specifically, you refer to criticisms about whether this is enough, whether the amount A will produce enough revenue for market jurisdictions. So I wanted to quiz you on that aspect.
Yeah, the thing is that while the formula of sharing revenue proposed by the OECD is welcome, but to begin with, the OECD formula includes a kind of threshold below which no revenue need be shared. So revenue has to be shared only if the profit is above a threshold, and that threshold is quite high. And then in the second portion, there is a formula, but that formula, if it is contested, can be litigated. The outcome of applying the formula can be litigated, and the outcome of that litigation is binding. Therefore, for emerging economies that may get some portion of that excess amount, usually have very little confidence as yet in the international arbitration process, because international arbitration outcomes are very heavily, significantly, maybe correctly, I'm not raising that, but in terms of the number of cases and so on, very significantly in favor of the advanced economy based headquartered multinationals. Therefore, the general feeling among emerging economies about the A, B, and so on that OECD has proposed is that they really lack confidence in this formula, as opposed to the UN formula that the UN has produced, but is not given so much importance by the advanced economies. The UN does not have any threshold. The UN does not say that the outcome of any arbitration would have to be mandatory acceptance of the outcomes. Therefore, the emerging economies certainly are more favorable to the UN, and therefore even some advanced economy researchers and practitioners are also becoming increasingly in favor of the UN being given the leadership of taking forward these very rapidly changing modes of international taxation.
Thank you. There's a couple of other features you described which contributes also in this area, but I'm going to leave that for readers to find out when they look at your article. The penultimate aspect you identify as contributing to instability or a lack of a core is the phenomena of retrospective taxation. Mm-hmm. I wondered if you can explain to us how that precisely introduces instability.
Yes. This I view as probably the crux in the feasibility of business operations, of MNC operations in emerging economies, as well as in advanced economies. But recently, we have had several cases of multinational companies being affected in India, for example. What does retrospective amendments of international taxation mean? It means that today, let's say a multinational has made an investment in, now it's 2021, let's say in 2015, and has begun operation. That decision to invest and begin an operation was based on a risk model of the multinational company. And that risk model reflected the attitude towards risk of the MNC. That is, it knew how much risk it wanted to take, and based on that, how much to invest, what would be the stream of profits or the profitability. They would make an actuarial projection and so on and so forth. But there was a risk, but they accepted the risk. They had a risk model and operated on that basis. So they went on for 5 years with that model. They were having some profits, they were, etc., etc. They expatriated some, they reinvested some. And now in 2021, the government, the domestic government, introduces a law saying that we are now amending the law, and law on taxability of the profits and so on and so forth. The new law will be applicable from 2010. not from 2021 or not from 2022. So the whole basis of foundation of the risk model of the MNC that started operation in 2015 now is changed completely, because if the law of the tax rates, the tax base, the tax avoidance rules and examination of audit and all that is changed, and that all that new change made in 2021, all the new changes are applicable from 2010, then from 2015 onwards, all the decisions and approaches taken by the MNC are null and void. Therefore, any profit that they have generated in the 5 years might actually have been losses. And therefore, I like to use the phrase, it turns into business into an impossibility to perform. And therefore, I think retrospectivity should not be used unless there is a clarification. And that clarification would lead to favor the business sector. If that clarification leads to favor the government, it is natural justice that the government, that is the extractor of the revenue, cannot and should not change and clarify its position for its own benefit. It goes completely against natural justice, and therefore it should not be done. And it is not just the MNC. The whole stream of profits and all that, of which some benefit went to the shareholders, some benefit went back to society, all of that becomes null and void. And everything goes to government. That's why I think retrospective taxation is an extremely poor premise for countries to adopt. And I think that some countries that had taken it are now rethinking their position on it.
Yes, and of course it's disappointing that at the level of the OECD or even the UN, nothing is done about it, and it's left to investment law essentially.
Yeah, yeah. The one reason for that is that if you really look at it, some advanced economies do have retrospectivity in their laws, but they are applied very selectively. But again, as long, selectively or not, as long as they are applied to favor government itself, I take the position that it is wrong. Whether it's an advanced economy or emerging economy, it just shouldn't be done. Because you invite MNCs to operate in the country, you give them a tax base, you tell them this is the tax law and so on and so forth. And while there is no guarantee that tax laws will not change in the future, of course they will change, but they should affect future years when it changes. And not to say that it will change from past years when they have already taken all business decisions, generated profits, distributed profits, and so on. That just is completely beyond natural justice, in my view.
Indeed, and the rule of law.
And the rule of law, yeah, because you change the law and so what is the perspective or the permanence of law? You can change it anytime in any direction, and that is not acceptable in modern times.
I want to move on to the last aspect, what you describe in your article, and that's the international tax architecture, and specifically the institutional architecture.
Yeah.
So back in 25 years ago, in the 50th Jubilee issue of the Bulletin, you elaborated on the idea of a global tax authority. And again, you introduced that and put it on the table. Now, I was wondering what is different today from 25 years ago? Why, again, the urgency to think about these questions of the architecture?
Yeah. Well, 25 years ago, I already believed in it, because at that stage, I was in the International Monetary Fund. I was the chief of tax policy, and I was the tax reform that we were assisting the countries with all went through my desk. So I had a really panoramic view of what was happening. And I was seeing that at that stage, there was very little exchange of information. Countries were doing very different things. And for example, in Asia, in East Asia and South Asia, the countries just were doing their own things without any information, interest to inform one another about what was going on. And there was some similarities, let's say, within South Asia, but mainly tax policy and government policy on the whole in many of these countries were being led by administrators and bureaucrats. So there was rather little professional contribution to changes. As opposed to that in Latin America, right from the start, their tax authorities and so on represented more professionals in the tax area. They came in with an administration. Once that administration left, they also left and new ones came and so on. But while they were professionals, there was this tendency of impermanence because the new group that came in always wanted to establish their own mark. And, even though something was working, they would just put their own stamp and get rid of the old, etc. So in one case, there was extreme cementing because the bureaucracy, etc., wouldn't change. And in the other, there was continuous flux, even though there was more professionalism. And but looking at a panoramic view, and then, of course, the US had its own way of looking at things. The UK had a very different way of looking at things if one looked at the UK VAT compared to EU. And so advanced economies spread out regionally, Latin America, South Asia, East Asia, when one looked, there was very little cohesion. And yet in country after country where I went, I must have gone to 40 or 45 countries in my journey, intervening, assisting and all that. One thing I realized is that at some point we must have an international taxation authority. In a way, we have an international development authority in the World Bank. In a way, we have an international financial authority in the form of the International Monetary Fund. In a way, the International Taxation Authority had emerged in the OECD, but it was really very narrowly based in terms of country participation. And they really didn't do very much of tax administration. There was in trade and customs, there was the World Trade Organization, but there was nothing as a global tax authority. And therefore, I felt that the world really needed something like that. But the one reason that that is a most difficult area is all countries consider tax policy as their own, that they can really manipulate like a puppeteer their own tax policy. And therefore, I also realized at that stage, the idea was too early to table. But at an academic level, I discussed it. Now I feel, to answer the bottom line of your question, the times have changed because advanced economies have begun to realize that their differences are coming to the fore. At that stage, 25 years back, they all were moving in tandem, more or less. But today, there is a big difference in the approaches taken by the US and Europe, and now with the exit of the UK from EU. The UK approach is quite different. And then, of course, the emerging economies are quite different. And those who are not in G20, they feel that, countries like, let's say, Argentina, Chile, and so on, who are really middle income countries, and they feel, or many countries in East Asia who are not included, so they feel that they have to be included. Therefore, I feel it is the ideal optimal moment, given the recognition by several advanced countries of a need for cohesion, of a need for control of tax havens, of a need for exchange of information, because there are so many challenges, including, as we all know, with non-tax challenges of the globe as we have emerged into this particular millennium. All of those things which can be, they are all strategic information exchange, etc. But we also need tax exchange of information. And all of that can be done, not necessarily with Action 13, is it, of the BEPS project, where there is some exchange of information. But again, if you really look at that exchange of information, there is some routine exchange of information. Then you have to request information, and advanced economies are very unlikely to give that information, because they say they are not sure how the information will be used by the emerging economies, and so on and so forth. My premise is that a really empowered global tax authority will have these powers, and we will really finally be moving towards a kind of information base and action taken approach that the world is bound to need in the new era, and added on because of digital economy and artificial intelligence. I mean, there's no way, because it's a completely new world that we are entering, and whether our policymakers and leaders recognize it or are aware of it, I don't know, but it is everywhere. It is everywhere to be seen. That is my view.
Thank you very much. Yes, indeed. I think one would not have great difficulty to agree that no one single country would be able to do it alone in this.
Exactly.
This age of technology and
yeah.
Professor Parthasarathi Shome, it's been a real pleasure to listen to you, and thank you very much for sharing your time and your insights and your experience with us.